The conference room door swung open like a thunderclap in the dead of night. Griffin froze. The will in his hand slipped to the floor, but not a single soul bothered to look at it. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the doorway, because the man who just walked in was supposed to be lying cold in the ground 2 weeks ago. Ezra Cross. Griffin's face shifted from shock to deathly pale in a heartbeat. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair behind him. You. He couldn't form a sentence. Ezra didn't rush. He stood there, still as a statue carved from stone. His gray eyes, colder than the Boston winter, howling outside, slowly swept across every face in the room. They landed on Griffin, then moved to Paige, the woman shrinking into the corner of the table, lips trembling but producing no sound. The room forgot how to breathe. Then Ezra spoke, his voice low and unhurried, each word dropping like a cold stone. Don't stop on my account. Continue. Keep reading. He stepped forward, picked up the will from the floor, glanced at it, then tossed it onto the table. I'm curious to hear how you plan to divide my fortune while my body wasn't even cold yet. If you want to know what happened in those 2 weeks and why Ezra chose to let the world believe he was dead, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share this story with someone you trust, because sometimes the ones who betray you are the ones sleeping under the same roof. 2 weeks earlier, Boston lay buried under the skin, cutting cold of winter. Snow blanketed the old, dignified streets in white, but inside the 40-story cross tower in the heart of the financial district, the air burned with a different kind of heat. 12 men sat around the long conference table, and not one of them dared to move. All of them were looking toward the man seated at the head of the table, Ezra Cross, 33 years old, the youngest leader in the history of the Cross Syndicate, the organization that controlled shipping, casinos, and luxury real estate along the east coast of the United States. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. A single glance from those icy gray eyes was enough to make even the most stubborn men lower their heads. The meeting had already dragged on for more than an hour. One senior member proposed expanding operations into the southern waters. Another objected, arguing that the risk was too great. They went back and forth, their voices growing sharper and harsher. Then Ezra lifted one hand. Just one small gesture. The room fell silent at once. He spoke, his voice low and unhurried. Postpone it for 6 months. Watch our rivals. When they make a mistake, we'll move. No one argued. No one dared. Ezra looked at the watch on his wrist. The Patek Philippe, his father, had left him. 6:15. He rose without a word of explanation and walked out of the conference room. The men who remained exchanged glances, but none of them looked surprised. They all knew that at this hour every day, the most powerful crime boss in Boston had an appointment more important than any business deal: his appointment with his daughter. The Cross estate stood on a hill in Beacon Hill, hidden behind rows of ancient trees. It was built in classic Gothic architecture, with soaring windows casting warm light out into the white curtain of snow. The black car stopped at the entrance. Ezra stepped out, his breath turning into a thin stream of smoke in the freezing air. He had barely set foot on the front steps when the great door flew open. A tiny figure shot out like a bullet. Daddy, Rosie Cross, 5 years old, hurled herself straight into Ezra's legs, her little arms wrapped tightly around him as if she were afraid he might disappear. Her black hair was exactly like her father's, but her warm brown eyes had come from her mother, from Nadia. The woman who had died 2 years earlier in a car accident Ezra still couldn't forget. And in that moment, something miraculous happened. The cold gray eyes of Ezra Cross softened. The corner of his mouth curved, a small smile no one at Cross Tower had ever seen. He bent down, lifted Rosie into his arms, and kissed her forehead. I missed you. I missed you too. Willa said you'd be home on time today. Willa was right. Ezra looked up. Standing in the doorway was Willa Sinclair, 27 years old, Rosie's nanny for the past 18 months. She had naturally auburn hair that she usually tied back in a neat ponytail, pale green eyes, and a scattering of faint freckles across the bridge of her nose. Willa wasn't from this world. She came from a different past, one harder and lonelier, but she had something no one else in this mansion could replace: the ability to make Rosie laugh again after Nadia died. Willa gave him a small smile and dipped her head in greeting. Ezra nodded in return. No words were needed. Between them was a trust built through actions, not promises. Dinner took place in the grand dining room, but today there weren't only 3 of them. Griffin Cross walked in. A bright smile spread across his face. 38 years old, He was Ezra's half-brother, slightly taller than Ezra, but leaner, with brown-gray hair, angular features, and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Little brother, you look exhausted today." Griffin patted Ezra on the shoulder, his voice full of concern. "Don't work so hard. Health matters more than money." Ezra only nodded and said nothing. Behind Griffin came Paige Harrington, 35 years old, Nadia's cousin. Since Nadia died, Paige had begun appearing at the mansion more and more often. "Let me take care of Rosie," she had once said to Ezra. "It's what Nadia would have wanted." She stepped forward and bent down to stroke Rosie's hair with practiced affection, but the little girl's eyes didn't light up the way they did when she looked at Willa. Rosie only sat there quietly, staring down at her plate. And in the corner of the room, standing as still as a shadow, was Victor Slade, 50 years old, a senior advisor, the man who had served the Cross family since Ezra's father was alive. He spoke little, but his eyes never stopped watching. Loyal, or simply waiting for his moment? Ezra didn't know. And that was what troubled him. Late at night, the mansion sank into silence. Ezra sat alone in his study, the glow of the desk lamp falling across his tired face. On the desk stood Nadia's photograph, her smile frozen in time. He picked it up, his fingers brushing lightly across the glass. In his mind, he heard his father's voice, the words spoken before the old man drew his last breath. "In this world, the most dangerous enemy is the one who sleeps under the same roof as you." At the time, Ezra was 25 years old, newly in charge of the organization. He hadn't understood what his father meant. 8 years later, he still didn't want to understand. Griffin was his brother. Paige was Nadia's family. Victor was the man his father had trusted most. They were family. They had to be family. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a whisper kept rising. One Ezra tried hard to ignore. The way Griffin looked around the mansion wasn't the gaze of a man who loved it, but the gaze of someone putting a price on it. Paige's concern for Rosie meant she was always present when Ezra was home, yet gone whenever he wasn't. Victor's silence wasn't the silence of a loyal man, but the silence of someone waiting. Ezra set the photograph down and looked out the window. Boston lay still in the night, while snow continued to fall softly, whitening the city. He didn't know that in only 48 hours, his world would shatter, and the people he called family would reveal their true faces. 2 days later, the Boston night was so cold that breath turned to white mist the instant it left the lips. Ezra stepped out of the Anchor, the waterfront seafood restaurant that on the surface was nothing more than a place for serving expensive meals, but inside was where the most important decisions of the Cross Syndicate were made. Tonight's meeting had run longer than expected. Numbers, agreements, the probing looks of senior members. Ezra had handled it all with his usual coldness, yet in the quiet center of himself, he was still thinking about Rosie. She had probably been asleep for hours by now. He would go home and kiss her forehead, even if she wouldn't know it. The parking garage beneath the building was as silent as a graveyard. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting alternating patches of brightness and shadow. Ezra's footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. 2 bodyguards followed behind him, keeping just enough distance. The black car was parked in the far corner, where the darkness was thick as ink. Ezra walked toward it, but suddenly he stopped. Instinct. That instinct, sharpened through 8 years at the top of the underworld, made him feel that something was wrong. The air was too still, too perfect. Then the blast tore through the night. Ezra turned in a split second, a reflex beyond thought. The bullet grazed his temple, leaving behind a streak of heat that burned like fire. Blood, red, wet, running down his face, dripping onto the white collar of his shirt. The shouts of the bodyguards, the crack of returning gunfire, the sound of footsteps retreating into the dark. Ezra went down, one knee hitting the cold concrete. His hand clutched his head, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through his fingers. The world spun, the flickering lights blurred into pale streaks. But he was still alive. Still alive. 20 minutes later, Ezra lay on a medical bed in a secret room known only to a few of his closest people. His private doctor, a man around 60 with steady hands, had just finished treating the wound. He stepped back, and there was no hiding the worry on his face. If you'd turned your head 1 second slower, the bullet would have gone through your skull. Ezra didn't answer. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, but his mind was somewhere else. He wasn't thinking about the death he'd just escaped. He wasn't thinking about the one who had fired the shot. He was thinking about Rosie. His little girl was only 5 years old. She had lost her mother 2 years earlier. If he had died tonight, what would have become of her? Who would lift her into their arms when she ran to the door to greet them? Who would kiss her forehead every night? Who would protect her from people like who? Griffin? Paige? Victor? Or all of them? The door opened. Miles Donovan walked in, his face darker than Ezra had ever seen it. 45 years old, a former FBI agent, Ezra's right hand for the past 6 years. The only person besides Rosie that Ezra trusted completely. Miles looked at the bandage on Ezra's head, his jaw tightening. The shooter belongs to a small gang outside the city. No name, no record, just hired hands. Who hired them? Ezra asked, his voice still as calm as if he were asking about the weather. Whoever it was used an anonymous account and moved the money through 3 countries before it reached them. We're tracing it, but it'll take time. Miles paused, his eyes heavy. But there's one thing we know for certain. Say it. That person knew your schedule tonight, in detail. Exactly. Knew you'd be meeting at the Anchor. Knew what time you'd go down to the garage. Knew how far behind you the bodyguards would be walking. A heavy silence filled the room. Ezra looked at Miles, and Miles looked back at him. They both understood the meaning of what had just been said. Only someone inside the house would know those things. Miles nodded and said nothing more. Ezra closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, faces appeared. Griffin with his smile that was a little too warm. Paige with her concern that always arrived at exactly the right time. Victor with the eyes that never stopped watching. And the other senior members too. Men who might have been waiting for him to fall so they could leap forward and take his place. Which one of them? One person, or more than one? Find out who's behind it. Ezra's voice was only a whisper, but colder than the winter night outside. Miles nodded once more. I will. But when he turned to leave, both men already knew a terrifying truth. An enemy who stood in the open could be defeated by strength. But an enemy hiding in the dark, one who ate at the same table, slept beneath the same roof, smiled at him every day, while quietly sharpening a knife behind his back. That kind of enemy was 100 times more dangerous. And Ezra had just realized that he was living among a pack of wolves, dressed in sheep's skin. 3 days passed. The wound at Ezra's temple had begun to heal, yet he remained inside the secret apartment whose location only Miles knew. The outside world believed that the head of the Cross Syndicate was resting after a business trip. No one knew that he had nearly died 72 hours earlier. Ezra sat by the window, looking out at the rooftops of Boston buried beneath a sheet of white snow. He hadn't slept much since that night, not because of the pain, but because of the questions that kept drilling through his mind without mercy. Who? Why? And most of all, when would they try again? Miles walked in and placed a cup of black coffee in front of Ezra. He sat down across from him, silent for a moment as though weighing every word. I've got an idea. Ezra didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed on the view outside. Say it. It's insane, but it might work. Say it. Miles drew in a deep breath. Fake your death. Ezra turned, his gaze sharp as ice. Miles went on before Ezra could object. Let the traitor believe you've fallen. Once they think they're safe, they won't need to be careful anymore. They'll come into the open. They'll start making moves. They'll show their real face. Silence. Ezra said nothing, but his gray eyes had already changed, from suspicion to thought. Miles saw it and continued. I've analyzed it. 3 people have the clearest motives. He opened a file and placed 3 photographs on the table. Griffin Cross, your half-brother. If you die, under family rules he's the lawful heir. He takes over the organization, the assets, everything. He's waited for this chance his whole life, even if he's never said it aloud. The second photograph. Victor Slade, senior advisor, served the family since your father's time. The old man knows too many secrets. He might want to build his own power, or he might be working with someone from outside. We don't know whether he's loyal to the Cross family, or only loyal to himself. The third photograph. Paige Harrington. Nadia's cousin. She has natural access to family information. Your schedule, she could learn through the times she helps care for Rosie. And after your death, as Nadia's only remaining relative, she could fight for custody of Rosie. Ezra looked at the 3 photographs in silence. Then he asked, his voice low and rough, Who do you think it is? Miles shook his head. I don't guess. I wait for evidence. That's why we need this plan. Ezra rose and walked toward the window. He pulled out his phone and opened his photo library. Rosie's face appeared on the screen. She was laughing, her 2 braids bouncing, her brown eyes shining like Nadia's. She'll think her father's really dead. Ezra's voice was no more than a whisper, but it was so heavy that Miles could almost feel its weight in the room. That's the price. Miles answered without softening it. But if you really die the next time, she'll lose her father forever. And the person who wants you dead, the one who hired a shooter to put a bullet in your head, that'll be the person who raises her. That sentence tore through every wall Ezra had built around himself. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he saw Rosie in Griffin's arms, being soothed by that false smile. Or Rosie under Victor's control, turned into a piece on an old strategist's board. Or Rosie beside Paige, being raised only so she could be used to control the fortune. Any one of them was a nightmare. No, it couldn't be allowed to happen. Ezra opened his eyes. His gaze had changed completely. No pain left, no hesitation left. Only the coldness of a man who had made his choice. Do it. Set everything up. Miles looked at him. Are you sure? There'll be no taking this back. Once the news spreads, all of Boston will think you're dead. Rosie will think you're dead. I'm sure. There wasn't the slightest tremor left in Ezra's voice. If I have to make her cry for a few weeks to protect her for life, I'll do it. If I have to become a ghost to expose the devils hiding in human skin, I'll do it. He turned and looked at Miles. Start. And the plan began. In the days that followed, everything was arranged with flawless precision. News of Ezra Cross's death would be spread. A funeral would be held. The casket would remain closed, and no one would be allowed to see the face of the dead man. And while all of Boston mourned or celebrated, Ezra would sit in the dark, watching every face through the camera system installed throughout the mansion. He would see who truly wept for him, who only pretended to cry, who smiled behind the casket, and who would begin to bare their fangs and claws the moment they believed the lion was dead. Ezra Cross would die before the eyes of the world, but from inside the darkness, he would watch them all, and when the truth was finally laid bare, the traitor would realize that they had never once been safe, not even when they believed he was lying beneath 6 feet of earth. The old church in the heart of Boston was overflowing with white flowers and the shimmer of candlelight. Hundreds of people had gathered on that bleak winter morning, business partners, rival figures, senior members of the organization, and even those who had never met Ezra Cross still came to pay their respects, or to make certain that the most powerful crime boss on the East Coast was truly dead. The black oak casket rested in the center of the sanctuary, its lid sealed shut. Inside, it was empty, but no one knew that. Griffin Cross rose and walked slowly toward the lectern. He was dressed in black, his face pale, his eyes red as though he had spent night after night in tears. When he stood before the microphone, his voice trembled, thick with grief, and he had to stop for several seconds to steady himself. My brother, Griffin began, tears slipping down his cheeks. Ezra was the finest man I ever knew, a great leader, a brother I always admired. He paused and lifted a handkerchief to his eyes. I'll carry this pain with me for the rest of my life, and I swear that I'll protect the family Ezra left behind, no matter the cost. The sound of sobbing rose from the front pews. Paige Harrington collapsed forward, her shoulders shaking in waves, and it took 2 people to lift her and guide her outside so she could breathe. Her grief looked so real that many others in the church couldn't hold back their own tears. In the corner of the room, standing silently like a shadow, Victor Slade watched everything. He didn't cry. His face showed nothing at all. His old eyes moved across each face in the sanctuary, as if memorizing them, as if judging them, as if waiting for something. But no one noticed, because all of them were looking toward the casket, toward the tiny little girl standing right beside it. Rosie wore the black dress Willa had prepared for her that morning. Her black hair had been tied back neatly with a white ribbon. Her brown eyes were red-rimmed, but there were no tears in them. She wasn't crying, because she didn't understand. Everyone said Daddy had gone away. Everyone said Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. But why? Daddy had promised to read to her tonight. Daddy had promised he'd come home on time. He had never broken a promise to Rosie. Willa stood right behind her, one hand resting gently on the little shoulder that wouldn't stop trembling. Tears moved silently down her face, but she fought to stay steady, fought to be strong for the child in front of her. Rosie looked up and turned to Willa with innocent eyes full of confusion. "Willa, when's Daddy coming home?" Her little voice, clear and fragile, sounded through the silence of the church, and it tore apart the heart of everyone there. Willa couldn't answer. Her throat closed. All she could do was bend down and pull Rosie into her arms, holding her tightly, as though she could shield her from the cruel truth she was still far too young to understand. Miles away, in a room black as night, Ezra sat motionless before 6 screens mounted on the wall. Each one showed a different angle of the church, the mansion, and the other places he needed to watch. He watched Griffin crying at the lectern, his voice breaking with emotion. He watched Paige collapse and be led outside. He watched Victor standing in the corner like a statue, observing everything with those unreadable eyes. Who was acting? Who was sincere? It was still impossible to know. Everything was perfect. Everything could have been real. Or all of it could have been a carefully staged performance. Then the screen showed the casket, and Ezra saw Rosie. She stood there, small and lost like a baby bird separated from the flock. The black dress was too large for her thin little frame. Nadia's brown eyes lifted to Willa, and her lips moved with a question Ezra didn't need to hear to know. "When's Daddy coming home?" Ezra's hand clamped down on the arm of his chair. The bones in his fingers turned white. His jaw locked. His chest felt as though an iron hand had closed around it. He wanted to rise, wanted to burst out of that room, wanted to run to the church, throw open the doors, pull his daughter into his arms, and tell her that Daddy was here, that Daddy hadn't gone anywhere, that he was sorry for frightening her. But he couldn't. Not yet. If he showed himself now, everything would fall apart. The traitor would disappear back into the dark, and he would never find out who they were. And next time, the bullet wouldn't miss. Ezra closed his eyes, drew in one deep breath, then opened them again. He kept watching the screens. The funeral ended. People began to leave one by one. The cameras recorded every face, every gesture. And then Ezra saw what he had been waiting for. Griffin stood beside the casket, wiping away the last of the tears from his cheeks. He turned to Victor and said something so quietly that the microphone couldn't catch it. Victor gave the smallest nod, almost too slight to be seen. Then Griffin turned his back on the casket, and for one brief moment, the corner of his mouth lifted. That smile came so quickly, it was nearly invisible. It existed for only a heartbeat before it was gone, but the camera had captured it, and Ezra had seen it. His jaw tightened, his gray eyes turned colder than ever. The door behind him opened. Miles stepped in and stopped beside Ezra. "The funeral's over. Griffin has moved into the mansion. He says it's to take care of Rosie." "I know. Do we start watching now?" Ezra didn't take his eyes off the screen, where Griffin was holding Rosie with a false tenderness so sickening it made him want to be sick. "Every mask falls in the end." His voice was cold as ice. "We just wait." Immediately after the funeral, Griffin moved into Cross Estate. To take care of Rosie, he explained to everyone in a voice full of solemn responsibility. The child needs family beside her at a time like this. But what the cameras recorded told a different story. On the first day, Griffin walked into Ezra's study as though it were his territory now. He sat down in the black leather chair Ezra had once occupied, placed both hands on the desk, and looked around with a satisfaction he didn't even bother to hide. He opened the drawers, leafed through confidential documents, and checked figures he had never before been allowed to touch. On the second day, he called a private meeting with the senior members of the organization, inside Ezra's room. In Ezra's chair, Victor Slade was present at every meeting, seated in his familiar place as advisor. He didn't say much, only watched, only listened, but there was something in the old man's eyes Ezra couldn't read. Not loyalty, not resistance. It was as if he were waiting to see whether Griffin was capable enough, waiting to see which side was worth his wager. Paige wasted no time either. She began taking inventory of the mansion's valuables, moving from room to room with a small notebook in hand, writing everything down with careful precision, the paintings on the walls, the antiques inside the glass cabinets, and most of all, Nadia's jewelry, still kept in the red velvet box in the master bedroom. She opened each case, studied every piece, as if she were appraising them. Meanwhile, Rosie was forgotten. No one asked whether she was hungry. No one read her a story before bed. No one held her when she cried for her father in the middle of the night. No one except Willa. One evening, while Willa was preparing a light meal for Rosie in the kitchen, the little girl suddenly asked, "Willa, does Uncle Griffin love Rosie?" Willa stopped what she was doing and turned to look at her. "Why do you ask that?" Rosie sat on the high chair with her legs swinging, her brown eyes lowered to the tabletop. "Because he never looks at me. He only looks at things. He looks at paintings. He looks at watches. He looks at Mommy's cabinet, but he doesn't look at me." In the dark room miles away, Ezra heard every word through the microphone. His jaw tightened until it hurt. The child was only 5 years old, yet she had seen through Griffin's nature more clearly than anyone else. The second week began, and everything fell apart faster than Ezra had imagined. Griffin summoned Willa into the study. When she stepped inside, Paige was already there, standing beside the desk with a face as cold as winter glass. On the desk, resting against black velvet, lay the diamond necklace that had once belonged to Nadia, the piece Ezra had given his wife on their wedding day. "We found this in your room," Griffin said, his voice flat, as though he were reading a sentence that had already been written. Willa looked at the necklace, then at Griffin, then at Paige. Shock, disbelief. "I didn't take it. I didn't even know where it was. I've never entered Nadia's room. My cousin's belongings." Paige spoke, her voice cold as ice. "You dared to steal my cousin's belongings." "I didn't. 2 choices." Griffin cut her off and raised a hand. "Leave now, or I call the police, and you'll leave in handcuffs." Willa stood there and understood the cruel truth. She had been framed. Someone had placed the necklace in her room. Someone wanted her gone, and she had no way to prove that she was innocent. She looked straight into Griffin's eyes and didn't look away. "You know I didn't do it." Griffin smiled faintly, a smile that never touched his cold eyes. "What I know is that you're no longer necessary. Pack your things and get out of here in 15 minutes. Willa was pushed into the hallway, where she came face to face with Rosie. The little girl was standing there, perhaps having heard the raised voices and run out to see what was happening. The moment she saw Willa with her reddened eyes, Rosie ran forward and wrapped both arms tightly around her. "Don't go! Willa, don't go!" Her voice trembled. Willa promised she'd stay with Rosie. Willa promised. Willa dropped to her knees and held the child in her arms, fighting to keep back the tears that were already burning behind her eyes. "Be good, Rosie. Listen to the grown-ups. Willa will come back." She didn't know whether what she said was true. She only knew she couldn't cry in front of the little girl. One of Griffin's men stepped forward, grabbed Rosie by the shoulder, and pulled her away. The child screamed and struggled, but it was useless. The great front door slammed shut in Willa's face. Rosie's crying echoed from inside, then grew fainter, then disappeared altogether. Willa stood outside the mansion in the skin cutting cold of a Boston winter. Her hands were trembling, her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. Instead, inside her chest, fury was beginning to boil. In the surveillance room, Ezra surged to his feet so suddenly that the chair crashed backward behind him. He wanted to go out there at once, wanted to kick the mansion doors open, wanted to wrap a hand around Griffin's throat and let him know he was playing with fire. Miles rose too and put a hand on Ezra's shoulder to hold him back. "Not yet." He threw Willa out. Ezra's voice came through clenched teeth. "He made my little girl cry. I know, but if you go now, we still won't know who was behind the assassination attempt. Griffin? Victor? Or are both of them working together? We need more time." Ezra stood there, his whole body taut like a wire stretched to the point of breaking. Then slowly, he turned back toward the screen. Rosie was sitting alone in her room, clutching the teddy bear her mother had given her, her brown eyes fixed on nothing at all. She wasn't crying anymore. She was only sitting there, silent, empty. "Record everything." Ezra's voice was cold as ice, but beneath it lay a fury waiting for the day it would finally erupt. "Everything they do, every word they say. When I come back, I want them to have nowhere left to run." 3 days after Willa left, Rosie changed completely. The little girl who had once run through the mansion with clear, ringing laughter now kept herself shut away in her bedroom and didn't step outside unless she was forced to. The child who had once finished every bit of the vegetables Willa prepared for her now pushed her food aside and didn't even bother to lift her fork. The little girl who had once asked hundreds of questions every day now didn't say a word, only sat there holding the worn old teddy bear Nadia had given her before she died, her brown eyes fixed on empty space. Griffin didn't notice, or didn't care to. When a housemaid reported that Rosie refused to eat, he only waved a hand. Kids get used to things. Don't spoil her. If she's hungry enough, she'll eat. Paige was even colder. She passed Rosie's room, saw the little girl sitting alone in the dark, and didn't stop at all. She needs discipline, she said to Griffin. Her mother spoiled her too much. That nanny spoiled her too much too. Let her fend for herself for a while and she'll get better. No one asked Rosie whether she was all right. No one read her a story before bed. No one sat beside her bed and held her when she woke in the middle of the night, in fright. No one wiped away her tears when she cried in silence. Rosie was completely alone. Late at night, the mansion sank into darkness. In the surveillance room miles away, Ezra sat before the screen, his eyes never leaving the image of Rosie's bedroom. The infrared camera showed the room in a ghostly pale blue light, and in the middle of a bed far too large for a 5-year-old child, Rosie sat curled in on herself, holding the teddy bear against her chest. She didn't know anyone was watching. She believed she was utterly alone, and because of that, she began speaking to the only thing she had left. Bear. Rosie's voice was tiny, trembling in the stillness of the night. Willa's gone. Daddy's gone too. Mommy's gone too. Silence. She held the teddy bear tighter, as if she were afraid it might disappear too. Why does everybody leave Rosie? Her voice caught. Is Rosie bad? Did Rosie do something wrong? Why? Why doesn't anybody stay with Rosie? Then she began to cry. Not loudly. Not with the wailing sobs children usually make, only silent tears slipping down her tiny cheeks, her shoulders shaking in waves in the dark. Daddy, she whispered into the darkness. Daddy, Rosie misses you. In the surveillance room, Ezra heard every word, saw every tear, felt every choked sob of his daughter like blades driven through his chest. He didn't move. He only sat there, gray eyes fixed on the screen, his body rigid as stone. Then slowly, he lowered his head. Both hands came up to cover his face, and his shoulders began to shake. For the first time since Nadia died. For the first time since he became the head of the Cross Syndicate. For the first time since he had told himself he had to be strong, had to be cold, had to become a wall of steel no one could break through. Ezra Cross cried. In silence, in darkness, alone, Miles stood behind him, witnessing everything, but he didn't say a word. He knew there were no words large enough for a moment like this. Nothing could comfort a father forced to watch his daughter breaking apart through a screen while being unable to do anything. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. No one counted. At last, Ezra lifted his head. His eyes were red, the tracks of tears still wet across his cheeks, but something in that gaze had changed. The desperate pain was gone. The tormenting hesitation was gone. What remained was a terrifying coldness, like the sky before a great storm, like the sea lying still before a tsunami rises. I'm going to end this. Soon, Miles stepped forward. We still need to know who's behind the assassination attempt. Whether it's only Griffin, or Victor too, or someone else besides them. I know, Ezra stood and turned to face Miles. But I also need someone inside to protect Rosie until I can return. She can't be alone anymore. Willa? Ezra nodded. She didn't leave Boston. I saw that she rented a small apartment 20 minutes from the estate. She's still trying to find a way back, still trying to find a way to stay close to Rosie. He turned back toward the screen. Rosie had fallen asleep, the tiny face still marked with the tracks of tears, the teddy bear still tucked safely in her arms. She's the only one who truly cares about my daughter. She didn't walk away, even after they threw her out. She didn't give up, even after they framed her. Miles was silent for a moment, then nodded. I'll contact her. Ezra didn't answer. He walked closer to the screen and placed his hand against the cold glass, right where Rosie's face appeared. Wait just a little longer for Daddy, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice rough and frayed. Daddy's coming home, I promise. His eyes darkened, colder than any winter. And the people who made you cry will pay for it, down to the last cent, down to every single tear. Willa didn't leave Boston. Even after being thrown out like a thief, even after being stained with an accusation she couldn't wash away, she stayed. She rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, 20 minutes from Cross Estate by car. The apartment was cramped, the walls were damp, and the window looked out over a dark alley, but she didn't care. She wasn't there for comfort. She was there because she couldn't walk away. Every night, Lying on the old narrow bed, Willa saw Rosie's eyes in her mind again. Those wide brown eyes, rimmed red, filled with confusion and fear when the little girl had been pulled from her arms. "Willa, don't go," Willa promised. That voice haunted her every night. She had promised. She had said she would come back, and Willa Sinclair had never broken a promise to a child. But she couldn't simply go back and knock on the mansion door. Griffin would call the police. She would be arrested for theft, and Rosie would lose forever the last person who truly cared about her. No, she needed another way. She needed to understand what was happening. Why did Griffin want her gone? Who had set her up? How had that diamond necklace been placed in her room? Willa began to investigate. She contacted Maria, a longtime housekeeper at the estate, a woman she had once been close to. Maria was still working there, and though she was frightened, she agreed to meet Willa at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. "Everything's changed, child," Maria said in a worried whisper. "Mr. Griffin is selling paintings, selling cars, even selling the antique pieces Mr. Ezra collected. So fast, like he's desperate for money." "What about Paige?" "She's always sitting with stacks of paperwork. I overheard a few things. Something about changing names, adding names onto property. I don't understand it, but it doesn't seem right." Willa didn't fully understand what any of it meant. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't an investigator. She was only a nanny who had been falsely accused. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something was terribly wrong inside that mansion, and Rosie was trapped in the middle of those people. Late at night, Willa sat in the tiny apartment, surrounded by scattered scraps of paper covered with notes about everything she had managed to learn. She was trying to fit the pieces together, but the picture was still blurred and unfinished. Her phone vibrated. Willa looked at the screen. Unknown number. No name. She hesitated for a second, then opened the message. "Keep going. You're on the right track." Willa's heart began to beat faster. Who sent it? Who knew what she was doing? Who was watching her? She typed back quickly. "Who are you?" Sent. Waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. No answer. Then the phone vibrated again. "Protect Rosie. At any cost. You're not alone." Willa stared at the words on the screen, reading them over and over. She didn't know who was contacting her. She didn't know what they knew, or what they wanted. But there was one thing she could feel clearly, in every word glowing from the screen. Someone was on her side. Someone else wanted to protect Rosie too. And she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Miles away, in the dark room lit only by the dim glow of 6 screens, Ezra set the phone down on the table. Miles stood behind him, watching with concern in his face. "Are you sure you want to pull her into this? She's only a nanny. Our world could swallow her whole." "She's already in it," Ezra said, his voice low and rough. "From the moment she refused to abandon Rosie, from the moment she chose to stay instead of running, she was already in, whether she knew it or not." He looked up at the screen. A public security camera near Willa's apartment showed her sitting by the window, streetlight falling across her thoughtful face, a faint line between her brows as she stared at the phone in her hand. "She's stronger than she thinks," Ezra said, his voice softening just a little. "She just needs to know she isn't fighting alone." The 3rd week since the funeral, late at night, Cross Estate lay buried in darkness, with only the light spilling from the study on the 2nd floor, the room that had once belonged to Ezra. Griffin sat behind the black oak desk, his hands clasped together, and there was no trace left of the false grief he had worn during the days of mourning. In its place was the cold calculation of a man making plans. Paige sat across from him, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of red wine in her hand. Neither of them knew that the microphone hidden inside the desk lamp was still working, recording every word they said and sending it live to the dark room miles away. "The girl's a problem," Griffin said, his tone blunt and without the slightest hesitation. "As long as she's still here, we can't move freely. Every time I try to do anything, somebody asks about Mr. Cross's granddaughter. Has Mr. Cross's granddaughter eaten yet? Has Mr. Cross's granddaughter gone to sleep yet? Is anyone taking care of Mr. Cross's granddaughter? It's a nuisance." Paige took a sip of wine and nodded in agreement. "She's a burden. And she's a reminder to everyone that Ezra once existed. We need her gone. Any suggestions?" "Boarding school." Paige set the wineglass down, her voice calm as if she were commenting on the weather. "Switzerland." There's a prestigious school there that specializes in taking children from wealthy families. Far away, quiet, and most importantly, nobody asks questions. As long as the money arrives on time, they'll keep the girl there until she's grown, if necessary. Griffin thought for a moment, then nodded. Take care of the paperwork. Tell everyone it's for the child's own good. A better environment after losing her father. International education. A bright future. People will believe it. They always believe beautiful words. Paige let out a soft laugh. A laugh with no warmth in it. And once she's gone, we'll have complete control. The will, the assets, the organization, everything. No one left standing between us and Ezra's empire. Ezra thought he built it all for his daughter. Griffin leaned back in the chair, satisfaction curling across his mouth. In truth, he built it for us. He just never knew it. The study door suddenly opened. Both Griffin and Paige flinched and turned. Victor Slade stepped in without knocking, without asking permission, as though he had the right to walk anywhere in this house. Griffin quickly regained his composure, but a flicker of caution still passed through his eyes. Victor, what's this about? Victor didn't answer right away. He looked at Griffin, then at Paige, his old eyes sweeping across their faces with a calm that couldn't be read. At last he spoke. I hear you're planning to send the girl away? Paige stiffened for an instant, but recovered quickly. That's a family decision, Victor. It doesn't concern. Victor raised one hand and cut her off in the middle of the sentence. A simple gesture, yet full of authority. The authority of a man who had survived under more than one leader. I'm not objecting, he said slowly. But if you're going to do it cleanly. Leave no trace. Leave no question for anyone to ask later. Griffin frowned. What do you want, Victor? Victor smiled, a smile that never reached his cold eyes. I want to make sure I'm standing on the right side, when all of this is over. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The door closed behind him, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Griffin looked at Paige, his voice lower now. How much does he know? I don't know. Paige shook her head, and a flicker of worry crossed her face. But he survived your father's era, and he survived Ezra's. He's not simple. We need to be careful. In the surveillance room miles away, Ezra heard it all. Every word, every sentence, every cold smile, and every filthy calculation. He sat motionless, gray eyes fixed on the screen, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. Griffin and Paige were clear now. They wanted Rosie gone. They wanted to seize everything he had built. But Victor? Which side was the old man on? Miles stepped closer, studying the screen with a thoughtful expression. Victor may just be an opportunist, the kind who sees one ship sinking and jumps to another. He doesn't care who wins. He only cares about standing on the right side when the game ends. Or he's the one behind all of it, Ezra replied, his voice cold as ice. Using Griffin as a disposable pawn, letting Griffin do the dirty work while he sits back and waits to collect the reward. We need proof about the assassination attempt, Miles said. If we can find who moved the money to the gunman that night, we'll know who the real mastermind is. Ezra nodded. Then find it. Use every resource we have. As for me, he looked up at the calendar hanging on the wall. I need to prepare for the will reading Griffin is planning. He wants to announce himself as the heir. He wants to send Rosie away on the same day. He thinks that'll be the day he wins. Ezra's eyes darkened. He'll realize soon enough that he's wrong. Ezra's phone vibrated. A message from Miles. Found a trail in the money transfer. Tracing it now. We'll have results in 48 hours. Ezra read the message, then set the phone down. Good, he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the storm that was coming. This ends this week. 48 hours later, the door to the surveillance room opened. Miles walked in, carrying a thin file in his hand, but the look in his eyes said that what was inside weighed more than 1,000 pages. Ezra was standing by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the gray winter sky over Boston. He didn't turn when he heard the footsteps, but his shoulders tightened slightly. We found it, Miles said, his voice low and careful. The money trail that paid the shooter that night. It moved through 3 anonymous accounts in 3 different countries, but we traced it back to the source. Ezra still didn't turn around. Say it. The original account was created from a computer inside Cross Estate, logged in through the house's internal network, and the transfer order used a personal confirmation code, the kind only the account holder could have. A heavy silence settled over the room. Ezra slowly turned, his gray eyes locking onto Miles. Whose was it? Miles didn't answer with words. He stepped forward and placed the sheet of paper on the table directly in front of Ezra. One name was printed in bold in the center of the page. Griffin Cross. Ezra looked down at the paper, looked at that name, the name he had called brother for 33 years of his life. The name of the man he had shared meals with, trusted with responsibility, believed would stand beside him when it mattered. Silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds. Then Ezra spoke, his voice rough, as though every word were tearing through his throat. He's my brother. He kept his eyes on the paper. I gave him everything. I gave him a place in the organization. I gave him money. I gave him my trust. And he wanted you dead, Miles said plainly, without softening it. Not just ready to take what was yours after you fell. He planned for you to fall. He hired someone to put a bullet in your head, Ezra. That's not greed. That's murder. Ezra lowered his head. Both hands braced against the table, his shoulders trembling faintly. A few seconds, or a few minutes. The room sank into a silence as heavy as the sky before a storm. Then he looked up, and Miles saw that something had died in those eyes. The pain, the disbelief, the fragile hope that maybe he had been wrong. All of it was gone. What remained was absolute coldness, the gaze of a man who had made his decision and would never turn back. What about Victor? Miles shook his head. There's no direct evidence tying him to the assassination attempt. He may be innocent of that, just an opportunist stepping in when he saw an advantage. He may know something and not have taken part. Or he's smart enough not to leave a trace. Ezra finished for him. We'll watch him during the confrontation. If he's guilty, he'll reveal himself. He straightened slowly and drew in a deep breath. It's time to tell Willa the truth. Miles studied him for a moment, then nodded and pulled out his phone. He dialed. The line rang 3 times before someone answered. Who is this? Willa's cautious voice came through from the other end. Someone wants to meet you, Miles said. About Rosie, and about the person who's been sending you those messages. A long silence followed. Then Willa spoke again, still guarded, but with something else now underneath it. Curiosity, hope. Where? 1 hour later. Willa stood outside the door of the secret apartment, her heart beating fast inside her chest. She didn't know what she was walking into, didn't know who was waiting for her on the other side. But if it had anything to do with Rosie, she was ready to face whatever was there. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her eyes sweeping quickly across the dark room. She saw Miles first, the middle-aged man with the stern face standing by the window. Then she saw another figure sitting in the corner of the room, his back turned toward her. The man stood up, turned around, and Willa's world tilted beneath her feet. You're dead. Her voice shook, and she stepped back as though she had just seen a ghost. Ezra Cross stood before her, flesh and blood, his gray eyes fixed on her without blinking. No, he said, his voice low and steady. I'm still here. Willa stood there, unable to move. Shock. Disbelief. Then slowly, the shock turned into something else. Anger. It rose through her like flame. You faked your death, she said, her voice trembling with the effort of holding herself together. While Rosie cried every night, while she sat alone in the dark holding that teddy bear and asking why everybody kept leaving her, while she thought there was no one left in this world who loved her anymore. Where were you? What were you doing? I know. Ezra didn't look away from her anger. I saw everything. I heard everything, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. He paused, and his voice dropped lower. But I did it to protect her. Someone wanted me dead, Willa. Someone hired a killer to put a bullet in my head. And that person was living in my house. If I came back without knowing who my enemy was, I'd die for real. And Rosie would be left in their hands forever. He told her the essentials. The assassination attempt. The decision to fake his death. 2 weeks of surveillance. And the truth they had just uncovered. Griffin was the mastermind. Willa stood still, absorbing every piece of it. Her anger slowly began to settle, replaced by understanding and something that looked very much like resolve. I need you, Ezra said. Not as a nanny, as an ally. You have evidence that Griffin's been selling assets, changing legal documents. Combined with my evidence about the assassination attempt, we can finish him. Willa looked at him for a long moment. measuring him. Then she asked, her voice quieter now, "Is Rosie all right?" "No," Ezra answered honestly. "She's not all right. That's why I need this ended quickly." Willa drew in a deep breath. Then she nodded, and her green eyes sharpened with determination. "Tell me what you need me to do." And there, in that dark room, the plan was laid out. The day of Griffin's will reading, the day he intended to declare himself the heir and send Rosie away, would be the day Ezra Cross returned from the dead, and every traitor would be forced to face the truth they had tried to bury. 2 days before the meeting, Ezra's secret apartment had turned into a command center. On the old wooden table, files were arranged in neat stacks, each one holding a fragment of the truth. Ezra and Willa sat across from each other, gathering every piece of evidence they had. Financial records showed that Griffin had sold more than a dozen family assets in the span of 2 weeks, from priceless paintings to cars to shares of stock. Altered documents showed that Paige had quietly added her own name to the list of co-owners on several properties. And most important of all, there was the transfer order carrying Griffin's personal confirmation code, sent to the account of the hired killers on the night of the attack. Miles contacted the loyal people inside the organization. The senior members he knew for certain didn't stand with Griffin. They didn't know Ezra was alive, didn't know the plan unfolding around them, but they would be present at the meeting tomorrow and would move when they were given the signal. Security was positioned discreetly around the estate. When Ezra appeared, Griffin wouldn't have any road left to run. On the night before the meeting, Willa sat alone in her small apartment, the streetlight pouring through the window and casting pale bands of light across the wall. In her hand was her phone, the screen showing a photograph of Rosie that she had taken a few months earlier, when the little girl had been laughing brightly in the flower garden behind the estate. She remembered her first day there. Rosie had lost her mother only a few months before, and back then the child didn't speak to anyone, didn't smile, didn't play. She only sat in a corner holding her teddy bear, her brown eyes fixed on empty space. Willa had been patient. Every day she read stories aloud to Rosie, even when the little girl gave no response. Every day she cooked something new and placed it beside Rosie, even when Rosie didn't touch it. Every day she sang the songs her grandmother had once sung to her, soft and gentle Irish folk melodies full of warmth. It had taken 3 months. 3 months of patience. 3 months of refusing to give up. Then one day, Rosie laughed. The sound had been clear and bright as the ringing of a bell, and Willa had nearly cried when she heard it. And now that laughter had vanished again. The little girl had folded back into the dark corner, had gone back to clutching her teddy bear and crying alone, had gone back to believing there was no one left who loved her. Willa tightened her grip on the phone. "Just wait a little longer, Rosie," she whispered into the darkness. "Willa's coming back. And this time, no one will ever pull us apart again." The next morning, Cross Estate. Snow drifted softly outside, laying a thin white cover over the rows of bare trees. Inside, the large meeting room on the first floor had been prepared with care. The long polished oak table had been arranged with solemn elegance. Chairs stood neatly in line on both sides. White flowers had been placed around the room as though this were a day of celebration. Griffin stood at the head of the room, making one last inspection. He wore a black suit. His hair was smoothed back neatly, and his face carried the confidence of a man on the verge of victory. Today was the day he had waited for all his life. Today, he would officially become the head of the Cross Empire. One by one, the senior members of the organization arrived. They shook Griffin's hand and offered their condolences for Ezra, but their eyes had already begun to look at Griffin with the respect reserved for a new leader. The family lawyer arrived carrying a thick file. Inside it, the will Griffin had secretly forged during the past few weeks. Victor Slade came earlier than the others and took his usual place in the corner of the room, his old eyes observing everything without comment. He gave Griffin a small nod of greeting, but his expression couldn't be read. Loyal? Or simply waiting to see who the final winner would be? Paige Harrington moved back and forth through the room, checking every detail. She had someone dress Rosie in her prettiest dress and brush her hair neatly, as though preparing her for a party instead of a farewell. Rosie's small suitcase had already been packed and placed by the door. Outside the gate, a black car was waiting, ready to take her to the airport the moment the meeting ended. 10 o'clock in the morning, the meeting began. Griffin stood at the head of the table and let his eyes sweep over every face. He cleared his throat and placed a hand over his chest with solemn gravity. "Thank you all for coming today. I know this is a difficult time for all of us." He paused, performing his familiar look of sorrow. "As you know, my brother, Ezra Cross, our beloved leader, has passed away. It's a loss beyond repair. But life must go on. The organization needs someone to lead it. And today, we'll announce the one who'll inherit Ezra's legacy. The lawyer stood and opened the file. The new will of Ezra Cross, signed on. The meeting room door opened. Rosie was brought in. She wore a white dress with a pink bow in her hair, pretty as a doll. But her brown eyes were empty, lifeless, as though her soul had left long ago. She looked around the room, searching for someone familiar. There was no one, only the cold, unfamiliar faces of grown-ups who didn't even bother to look at her. Griffin continued. After the will is announced, my niece Rosie will be sent to a prestigious international boarding school in Switzerland. This is the best decision for her future, giving her a better educational environment and keeping her far from the painful memories here. Rosie heard him. Her eyes widened. Boarding school? Going away? She didn't understand all of it, but she understood one thing. They wanted to send her away. No, she cried, rising to her feet, her voice trembling but filled with desperation. Rosie doesn't want to go. Rosie wants to stay here and wait for Daddy. Daddy's coming back. Daddy promised. Griffin lost patience, and the mask of kindness slipped away in an instant. Your father's dead, he said, his voice cold. Accept it. Rosie began to cry. Her tiny sobs echoed through the silent room. No one comforted her. No one held her. They only stood there, watching, waiting for the child to finish crying so the meeting could continue. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. All assets are to pass to Griffin Cross, with Paige Harrington as co-administrator. Then the meeting room door burst open, and everything changed. The meeting room doors flew open like thunder cracking across a clear sky. Cold wind rushed in from outside, carrying tiny flakes of snow that melted almost at once on the polished wooden floor. Griffin froze in the middle of his sentence, his mouth still open, but no sound came out anymore. The will slipped from the lawyer's hand and drifted down to the floor like dry leaves in autumn, but no one even looked at it. Every eye in the room turned toward the doorway, because the man who had just stepped inside was the man who should have been lying 6 feet under for the past 2 weeks, Ezra Cross. He stood there in the flesh, wearing the familiar black suit, his gray eyes colder than the winter raging outside. Right behind him was Willa, holding a thick file tightly against her chest, her face calm but her eyes bright with determination. The room exploded into chaos. One senior member lurched to his feet so suddenly that he knocked over a glass of water. Another stumbled backward so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. Whispers broke out, shocked cries, the scrape of chairs dragging across the floor. In the corner of the room, Victor Slade was the only one who remained seated, but the old man's eyes had changed. The calm watchfulness was gone. In its place was calculation moving as fast as lightning, reassessing every move, deciding which side he ought to stand on now. Griffin opened his mouth, his voice shaking beyond his control. You. He couldn't finish the sentence. Ezra didn't answer. His gray eyes moved slowly across the room, from one face to the next, cold as ice, sharp as a blade. They stopped on Griffin, then moved to Paige, the woman shrinking into the corner of the table, her lips moving but no sound coming out, then slid past Victor, still sitting there like a stone figure. Then a voice rang out, clear and bright through the chaos. Daddy! Rosie. She was the first one to move. While all the grown-ups still stood frozen like statues, she had already jumped from her chair and run toward Ezra with all the strength in her tiny legs. Her white dress fluttered behind her. The pink bow slipped from her hair and fell to the floor, but she didn't care. Ezra dropped to his knees just as Rosie threw herself into his arms. He held her so tightly it was as though he feared that if he loosened his grip even a little, she would disappear. I'm sorry, he whispered into her black hair, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, Rosie cried. But not the broken crying of those nights when she had sat alone in the dark. This was the crying of joy, the crying of a child who had just found again the most precious thing she had lost. Daddy came back. Daddy really came back. Daddy didn't leave Rosie. Willa stood beside them, her eyes shining red. She didn't cry, but tears were right there, waiting to fall. She had waited for this moment. She had fought for this moment, and at last it had come. Ezra kissed Rosie's forehead, then slowly rose to his feet. Rosie refused to let go of him, clutching the edge of his suit jacket as though she were afraid he would vanish again if she loosened her hand. He didn't make her let go. He turned toward Griffin, and all the warmth he had just given his daughter vanished in an instant. In its place came something terrifyingly cold, the look of a predator staring at prey that had finally walked into the trap. Griffin tried to steady himself, tried to force a smile. Ezra, you're alive. It's a miracle. Why didn't you let the family know? I've been worried sick. Quiet, one word, short, cold. Enough to make Griffin stop in the middle of the sentence, the smile dying on his lips. Ezra turned to the lawyer who was standing there trembling beside the table. Give me that. Willa stepped forward and set the file down on the table, with a sound that seemed to echo through the room's total silence. She opened it, her voice calm but clear. Proof of asset theft. More than 12 transactions involving the sale of paintings, cars, and stock within 2 weeks, all of them carried out without the consent of the lawful owner. She turned the page. Proof of illegal alteration of the will. The will that was just being read is a forgery, created after Ezra Cross was supposedly dead. She turned another page. And this. Her voice hardened. The transfer order dated December 9th, sent to the account of a hired gang of killers. The amount was $250,000, payment for the attempt on Ezra Cross's life. She looked up, straight into Griffin's eyes, from an account using Griffin Cross's personal confirmation code. The room erupted into murmurs. The senior members looked at one another in shock, then looked at Griffin with entirely different eyes. No respect left now, only disgust. Griffin turned pale and staggered back one step. That's fabricated. Slander. Someone framed me. You don't have proof. I do, Ezra cut in, his voice cold as ice. I've watched everything you've done for the past 2 weeks. Through every camera in this mansion, I've heard every word you've said, every plan you made with Paige, every smile you hid behind my casket. He turned to Paige. She was trembling now, trying to shrink into the corner of the room as though she could disappear into the wall. And you used your sister's name, used the bonds of family, to walk into this house. Then you helped the man who wanted to kill your own sister's husband. You framed an innocent nanny. You took part in the plan to send your own sister's daughter away. What do you think Nadia would say if she could see you now? Paige burst into tears, but no one pitied her. Ezra turned to Victor Slade. The old man was still sitting there, his face unreadable. And you? What did you know? Victor rose slowly, brushing off the front of his suit jacket, as though preparing for an ordinary negotiation. I knew Griffin was ambitious. I suspected he had plans of his own, but I had no concrete proof. You had no proof? Or you chose not to look? Silence. Victor didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. You weren't behind the assassination attempt, Ezra said, but you didn't stop it either. You knew something was wrong, and you chose to wait, to see who would win, then stand with that side. That's survival, Victor replied, with not a trace of regret in his voice. That's cowardice. Ezra turned his back on him. As of today, you have no place in this organization. Then he faced Griffin one last time. You wanted my empire. You wanted me dead. You were even ready to send my daughter away so you could take full control. Everything I built, you wanted to strip it bare and make it yours. Griffin backed up until the wall caught him. Nowhere left to run. Ezra, I'm your brother. We're blood. You can't do this to me. Blood? Ezra repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. Blood doesn't hire someone to put a bullet in his brother's head. Blood doesn't leave a 5-year-old little girl crying alone in the dark. Blood doesn't plot to send a brother's child away in order to steal his fortune. He stepped closer. Griffin shook. You were never my brother. You were only a man in disguise, waiting for your moment, waiting for me to fall so you could climb up over my corpse. His voice dropped lower, harder. From this moment on, you no longer carry the Cross name. The doors opened. Ezra's men, the loyal ones Miles had contacted in advance, stepped inside. Griffin tried to fight when they grabbed his arms, but it was useless. He shouted, begged, threatened, but no one listened. Paige wept and pleaded as they dragged her away with him, but not a single person in the room showed even a shred of pity. Victor Slade walked out after them in silence, saying nothing. He knew his time was over. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to bargain for. As the heavy doors thudded shut, the screaming faded into the long corridors of the estate, but they weren't just being thrown out into the snow. At the foot of the hill, Miles had already arranged for a fleet of federal authorities to be waiting. The mountain of evidence Willa and Ezra had meticulously gathered, the digital trail of the hitmen's payment, the forensic proof of the forged signatures, and the records of the assets Paige had tried to siphon, was already in the hands of the district attorney. Ezra had ensured that their betrayal wouldn't just result in social exile, but in decades behind cold steel bars. In the Cross Syndicate, mercy was rare, but under Ezra's new rule, justice was absolute. The doors closed. The room fell into silence. The remaining senior members looked at Ezra with new eyes. Not just respect anymore, fear. Then a tiny voice broke through the silence. "Daddy, they aren't coming back, are they?" Rosie. She was still holding tightly to his hand. Her brown eyes lifted to his, with the last trembling trace of fear still inside them. Ezra knelt down until he was level with her. He looked into those eyes, Nadia's eyes, the eyes he had stared at through a screen for 2 weeks and ached over every night. "No," he said, his voice gentle but certain. "Never again." 1 week later, Cross Estate had grown quiet again. No more hurried footsteps from Griffin pacing through the rooms, as though he were taking inventory of everything he meant to claim. No more Paige, with that cold little laugh, admiring things that had never belonged to her. No more Victor Slade, with his watchful, calculating eyes in every corner of the house. Only the people who truly belonged there remained. Rosie had begun to laugh again, not as often as before, not yet with the pure, bright music she had carried in the days when her mother was still alive, but more with each passing day. Every morning when she woke, her father was already seated at the breakfast table waiting for her. Every night when she went to bed, he sat beside her and read until her eyelids grew heavy and closed. And beside her, always, was Willa, no longer as a nanny receiving wages, but as something that couldn't be separated from this family anymore. On a winter afternoon over the weekend, Willa stood in the hallway with her bag over her shoulder, the pale light of the season falling through the glass and brushing across her face. Ezra stepped out of his study and saw her standing there with the posture of someone about to leave. He stopped and asked, "Where are you going?" Willa turned toward him, a faint smile on her mouth, but sadness in her eyes. "My work here is done. Rosie is safe. You don't need." "Rosie needs you," Ezra cut in, his voice firm. Then he paused, as though trying to find words for something he wasn't used to saying out loud. "And this house needs you." Willa looked at him, silence stretched between them. "I'm not part of this world," she said at last, her voice soft but clear. "I'm only a nanny from a working-class neighborhood. I don't have a name that matters, or money, or power. I don't belong in a place like this." "You're the only one who didn't run when everything fell apart," Ezra answered, his eyes steady on hers. "When I died, the people who called themselves family rushed in to steal what they could. But you, someone who owed this family nothing, were the one who stayed. You were thrown out, falsely accused, threatened, and still you stayed in Boston. Still, you searched for a way to protect Rosie. You were willing to stand against an entire organization to protect a child who wasn't even your own." He took a step closer. "You're not just anything. You're the person I trust. You're the person Rosie loves. You're the person." He stopped, his jaw tightening as though he were fighting something in himself just to say the next words. "You're the person this house has been missing for the past 2 years. Willa held his gaze for a long time. Her green eyes searched his gray ones for something unspoken, something deeper than what either of them had the courage to name. Then, slowly, she lowered her bag to the floor. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The gesture said everything. That evening, the living room of the estate glowed with warm light. Rosie sat on the rug in the middle of the room, surrounded by crayons and sheets of paper. Willa sat beside her, helping her choose colors, laughing softly now and then when Rosie came up with strange little shapes only a child could understand. Ezra sat on the sofa across from them. No laptop, no phone, no business calls, no stacks of reports waiting for him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was simply there, fully there, watching his daughter draw, listening to her laughter, feeling the peace he had thought was gone forever from the day Nadia died. "Daddy," Rosie jumped up and ran toward him with a sheet of paper in her hand. "I'm done. Look." She held the drawing out, her eyes bright and shining as she waited. Ezra took the paper gently and looked down. It was clumsy and uneven, like every drawing made by a 5-year-old child. 3 figures standing in front of a large house. The tallest one, with black hair, stood on the left. The shorter one, with reddish hair, stood on the right. And in the middle was the smallest figure, holding both their hands. "This is Daddy," Rosie said, pointing to the figure with black hair. "This is Willa." She pointed to the one with red hair. "And this is Rosie." Her little finger landed on the tiny figure in the middle, where two small hands were wrapped tightly around the hands of the grown-ups on either side. "This is our home." Ezra looked at the drawing for a long time. The house had big windows and a steep roof, and a bright yellow sun burning in the corner of the page. And the three people standing before it weren't alone. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice roughening slightly. Rosie smiled. It was the first smile in weeks that truly reached her eyes. Late that night, Rosie was asleep in her room, the teddy bear still tucked safely in her arms, but now her little face was peaceful, free of tears, free of nightmares. Ezra stood on the balcony looking out over the glittering lights of Boston below. The city shone like millions of stars spilled down onto the earth, flickering through the darkness. Snow had begun to fall again, tiny white flakes drifting through the air before coming to rest on the railing. Soft footsteps sounded behind him. Willa stepped onto the balcony and came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She only stood there with him, looking out over the sleeping city. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence shared by people who didn't need words in order to understand each other. "I used to think family was blood," Ezra said at last, his eyes still fixed on the distance. "I grew up believing that the people who shared your blood would always stand beside you, that they'd protect you, that they'd love you without condition." He stopped and drew in a long breath. "I was wrong." Willa didn't answer right away. She let the silence settle, let his words have space to sink into the night between them. Then she spoke, her voice gentle. "Family isn't the people who share your blood. Family is the people who choose to stay when they could leave. The people who choose to fight beside you when they could choose safety for themselves. The people who choose to love you not because they have to, but because they truly want to." Ezra turned his head and looked at her. Willa looked back. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, the silence between them wasn't a wall. It was warm, like firelight in a hearth, like the feeling of invisible arms wrapped around you. He turned and stepped back inside. Willa followed him. The balcony door closed behind them, shutting out the winter cold beyond the glass. Inside the house, warmth spread softly through everything. The steady sound of Rosie's breathing drifted from her room. Her crooked little drawing had been taped to the refrigerator, 3 figures holding hands in front of a big house. Outside, the snow fell thicker and thicker, covering Boston in white, hiding the old scars, preparing the world for a new beginning. An old chapter had ended. The traitors had been punished. The masks had fallen away, and the people who truly belonged to one another had found each other at last. A new chapter had begun. Not one written in blood, but one written in choice, in loyalty, in love freely given and never forced. Because in the end, real family isn't the people born into the same bloodline. It's the people who choose to remain when the storm comes crashing down. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to support our channel. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moving stories we share each day. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, please share it with them now. We'd truly love to hear how you feel. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below and share the thoughts rising from the deepest part of your heart. Every comment you leave is a great source of encouragement that helps us continue creating even more meaningful content. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.